impressive thing I can tell people. Now I just tell people I'm Carl Trueman's boss. And people are, they get it, they understand. But we are truly privileged to have Carl speak to us. He's written lots of books, dozens of books, and the most recent one he's written, I keep forgetting the title of the shorter book. Can you tell me what it is? A Strange New World, which is an abbreviated version of a longer book he wrote, a longer treatise on sexuality and how to kind of view it historically. It has really, really been an important book for us in our the church in the time that we find ourselves in. He's written all sorts of other books in church history and Christian theology, all sorts of different areas, and we are so privileged to have him here to teach our students, but also to speak to us. And the topic that he's going to speak to us on is light momentary affliction, the secret to resilient ministry. So I'm not going to take any more time. Carl, we're grateful to have you. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks for kind words of welcome. First, a small apology. I've always despised speakers who only turn up to conferences for their own paper. I had to do that today. Two reasons. I didn't get back home till midnight last night. I spent the week in Memphis, or last half a week in Memphis, which was interesting. I was locked in a restaurant on Wednesday night as the shooting rampage was going on outside. And also, my wife is away. So this morning was spent trying to keep the house relatively tidy so that when she comes back in 2 weeks' time, I won't have too much to do. But it's a pleasure to be with you this afternoon. As I reflected on the title, part of me thinks it's maybe hypocritical is the wrong word, but certainly I'm not particularly qualified to point to my own experience as a pastor, serving on session and also then serving as a pastor. As an example of resilient ministry. I consider myself really to have failed, actually, as a pastor ultimately. I was a pastor in Philadelphia for 6 years. I had 3 good years. I think a lot of people, when they're called to the pastorate, have a kind of honeymoon period. My honeymoon period lasted for 3 years. And then I had 3 very hard years, 3 discipline cases, one after the other, of increasing levels of seriousness. By the time we'd finished the second one, I was absolutely worn out. And then a young man turned up in my office one morning and said, I think my dad is abusing my mum. And so that triggered 18 months of deep unpleasantness, culminating really in the discovery that I had a member in my congregation who'd been abusing his wife since their honeymoon 38 years previously. And I think I knew the day that young man came to my office. I remember thinking to myself, I got one more round left in me. We're going to deal with this, and then I'm done. I remember actually in the day I left the meeting where my corps was dissolved, one young man referred to me as a failed experiment, which my wife deeply appreciated and mentions to me every 6 months. And one of my elders came up to me and said, the next guy should be very grateful to you, he said, because you took all the garbage out for us, which I thought was a rather entertaining way. But my pastorate ultimately was not that resilient. So what I want to talk about today, I want to look at somebody who suffered far more than I'd ever did in the pastorate, and yet had a framework for resilience, and then offer some thoughts at the end as to how that might work out for us today. The person I'm thinking of course, is the Apostle Paul. You'll have picked up the allusion from the title of my talk to Paul's second letter to the Corinthians, or as we say back home, 2 Corinthians. 2 Corinthians. Of all the New Testament letters, the Corinthian correspondence is my favorite. In a previous existence, I was a Reformation guy. Martin Luther is my first great love in terms of Reformation. I did my PhD partly on the reception of Martin Luther's thought and writing in the English context. And I came to love Luther's understanding of the cross and his theology of the cross that is drawn in large part from 1 Corinthians. And yet the 2 letters go together rather beautifully. I think what you have in 1 Corinthians is Paul articulating a theology of the cross. And in 2 Corinthians, demonstrating that the shape of his ministry and the pattern of his ministry follows the logic of the cross. The problem he really faces in Corinth is this. He's dealing with a culture that is, we might say, a new money culture. Not like my homeland, where status was very much tied to land. This was a culture like America, where status was tied to money. And Paul's outward poverty, his lack of possessions, the fact that he wasn't a success by Corinthian standards, had led the Corinthians to accuse him of, well, not being a true apostle. And what Paul does in 2 Corinthians, I think, rather beautifully but rather painfully, is to demonstrate that although not every pastor has to suffer as Paul suffers, the fact that a pastor suffers and is contradicted in his ministry does not necessarily call into question the authenticity of his ministry or the gospel. And just as a side at this point, I would also say this. There's a lot of, I think in some ways, appropriate concern these days about spiritual abuse and pastors abusing congregants. I would say this, though. In my time as a Christian, I've never been abused by a pastor. And I have known many Christians who've never been abused by their pastor. I have never come across a pastor, at least a pastor of what I would call an ordinary church, like the one that I pastored, between 50 and 150 people, let's say. I've never come across a pastor of an ordinary church who has not been abused by his congregants. Somebody at some point needs to start talking about how congregants abuse their pastors. I used to love those emails. You get them on a Sunday evening. Somebody will write you an abusive email on a Sunday evening just to encourage you after you get back home tired. I remember one in particular, actually, where this was an impressive one. The person referred to me as a carpetbagger. I didn't even know what a carpetbagger was. I had to look it up in a dictionary. I thought, yeah, respect. I mean, if you most of the time you get abusive emails and it's just obscene. When somebody sends you an abusive email, you've got to use the dictionary to work out how and why they're insulting you. They put some effort into that. That's an impressive thing, and they should get some credit. Anyway, I'm going to read the passage that I want to reflect on, then offer some reflections on it, and then offer some thoughts on how this might work out in practical everyday ministry. The passage is, of course, from 2 Corinthians chapter 4. And I think perhaps these might be the greatest verses that Paul ever pens. Certainly the most personal among the verses that Paul ever pens. Since we have the same spirit of faith, according to what has been written, I believed and so I spoke, we also believe and so we also speak, knowing that he who raised the Lord Jesus will raise us also with Jesus and bring us with you into his presence. For it is all for your sake, so that as grace extends to more and more people, it may increase thanksgiving to the glory of God. And then comes this wonderful passage that I think every pastor should have in their heart. So we do not lose heart. Though our outer self is wasting away, our inner self is being renewed day by day. For this light momentary affliction is preparing for us an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison, as we look not to the things that are seen, but to the things that are unseen. For the things that are seen are transient, but the things that are unseen are eternal. Really what I want to do with this passage is hammer home something that I think is very important. I remember hearing a Roman Catholic friend, a past priest, actually talking about troubles within the Catholic Church and saying problems always start when we allow our theology to be driven by felt needs or by what we see to be the needs of pastoral practice. He said we need to understand that theology needs to drive how we understand reality and how we relate to that reality, not the other way around. And that's what Paul does here. I think he lays out some wonderful truths that as pastors you need to meditate on regularly. First of all, Paul emphasizes the fact that he has a common identity with God's people throughout history. Paul does not view his own ministry as isolated from history itself. He sees himself as standing in a long line of people who've experienced God's faithfulness. And knowing that God has been faithful in the past allows him to be confident that God will be faithful in the present. How does Paul know that? Well, I think he puts two things into this passage that point us to his basis for this understanding. First, he points to the fact that he shares the same spirit with those who came before. He even cites Psalm 116, verse 10 here, I believe even when I spoke. Paul stands in a line of the people of God because he possesses the same spirit as they do. The ESV, that's I think sort of default translation for many people now, uses a small case s there, spirit of faith. And it could be spirit of faith, meaning sort of the essence of the gospel, that what holds him, binds him with those who've come before is they all believe in the same gospel. I think, however, you can make a case for saying it might mean the Holy Spirit. There's nothing in this text, I think, that would contradict the idea of it being the Holy Spirit, that Paul possesses the same spirit as those who've gone before. He who creates faith and was the one who inspired the speech of the psalmist is also the one who now inspires Paul. I think the practical significance of that difference is almost none. The point that Paul is making is very clear. He's claiming essential continuity with the psalmist and with the people of God throughout the ages. And then that enables him to claim their history as his history, their thoughts as his thoughts. And I would also add, my friend Charles Brown is here and will be amening at this point, their songs as his songs. The Psalms, very importantly there. I knew the Reformed Presbyterians would come through for me. The Psalms can also be claimed. And I'm going to say at the end, one of the important things I think for a resilient ministry is not neglecting the form and content of public worship. Public worship shapes the Christian imagination in profound ways. And the Psalms create the right framework for understanding the here and now. They create a right set of expectations for what we can look for in this life. Paul has a vision of God and of God's actions rooted in his understanding of God's treatment and faithfulness to his people in the past. But I think secondly, the other thing that Paul points to here is suffering. What is it that binds Paul together with God's people in the past? It isn't just the gospel. It isn't just the Spirit. We might say it's the experience of being a gospel person that ties him to these people as well. There is a historical continuity with the past. When you look at Psalm 116 that Paul's citing here, it's a psalm of suffering. Paul's experience, which of course is the pointed issue with the Corinthians, why are you suffering? Why do you appear so outwardly weak and mediocre? Paul is using that point here to drive home the deeper point that this does bind him together with God's people in times past. The section from which Paul quotes reads as follows, I believe even when I spoke, I am greatly afflicted. I said in my alarm, all mankind are liars. What shall I render to the Lord for all his benefits to me? He says, I will lift up the cup of salvation and call on the name of the Lord. I will pay my vows to the Lord in the presence of all his people. It's one of the beautiful discontinuities, I think, between the teaching of the Bible on suffering in our inner space and the way we're taught to think about suffering in inner space today. The psalmist moves inward to examine his inner suffering only to move outward and set it in the context of God. And of course, he uses the covenant name to set his sufferings in the present in the context of God's historic covenant faithfulness to his people throughout history. And Paul is I think he's having a little poke at the Corinthians here. He's essentially saying, my experience with you is tracking with the experience of the psalmist in Psalm 116. Who's going to come out of this as the people who are on the right side of that question? The Corinthians simply cannot understand the shape of Paul's ministry in terms of its suffering. Raises the question, of course, is why suffering is a regular part of the life of God's people, individually and corporately. I remember I'm very glad to have got out of the pastorate. A colleague asked me recently, do you ever think of going back into the pastorate? And I said, some days I may come close to losing my faith, but I never come close to losing my mind as far as I'm concerned. One of the things that I'm grateful for, though, was it gave me an insight into the intense suffering that a lot of people have to handle in their lives. I remember one lady in particular in my congregation, a single mother, 3 kids. The oldest daughter was a very troubled young lady, won't go into the details. This lady was working 2 jobs just to live on the poverty line. And it always struck me that so much of the gospel that's peddled, particularly in America, I have to say, by people like Joel Osteen and company, has nothing to say to the lives of somebody like that. There was no point in me saying to her, just hang in there and things will get better. No, things were going to get worse. And then she was going to die at some point. We have to have a gospel that addresses that, and Paul is pointing to that here. Why is there such suffering in the world? Why did that lady suffer the way she did in my congregation? Well, the world is not as it should be. It's under a curse. And I might suggest that Christians who know that are perhaps more sensitive to the injustice of that than others. Christians see the fallenness of the world in its full horror and its full mystery in a way that others don't. And suffering, I think, is also a great reminder that the gospel is ultimately about the heavenly city, that we have no lasting city here. I'm going to come back to that when I think about how do we remain resilient in this. Secondly, Paul goes on to relativize his suffering, not simply by demonstrating or pointing to the fact that this is continuous with the experience of God's people throughout the ages. He relativizes it by pointing to the resurrection. The Spirit, of course, is where the resurrection is rooted. The Spirit is the one who strengthens and animates. In the Old Testament, think of Gideon. Think of Samson. The Spirit rushes on Samson and he becomes this sort of Superman kind of figure. The Spirit is the one who transforms us, who sets us at war with ourselves. But there's more. The Spirit is also a guarantee. It is God who establishes us with you in Christ, he says, and has anointed us, and has also put his seal on us and given us his Spirit in our hearts as a guarantee. He has prepared us for this very thing. Is God who has given us the Spirit as a guarantee. Again, that's, by the way, is what inclines me to read the reference to the Spirit in this passage as a reference to the Holy Spirit and not the essence of faith. And it's not just, of course, Paul's saying, it's not just that the Spirit gives Paul a warm, fuzzy feeling. That's not what the Spirit does. The Spirit is a seal because he is a down payment, a guarantee that whatever happens to Paul in the present and whatever he experiences must ultimately give way to the resurrection at the end of time. All of this suffering will be relativized and ultimately negated by the resurrection. And that, of course, is connected to history. It's not a feeling. You know, there's that dreadful hymn, you ask me how I know he lives within my heart. My previous institution, I served for a while as Vice President for Academic Affairs, and the only thing I miss about that job was I did have a personal assistant who kept my life in order for me. But she was from a somewhat different Christian background to me. She was very fundamentalist, dispensationalist. And when she took the job with me, her mother said to her, "I can't believe that you're going to work for the enemy." I thought it was a great way of describing me. I was the enemy. But anyway, she was telling me one day that's her favorite hymn. And I said, that's German liberalism. I thought you were a fundamentalist. She said, "What do you mean?" I said, "You don't believe, you don't know he lives because you feel it in your heart. You know he lives because the tomb was empty. And the Bible tells you so. It doesn't matter how you feel. It matters that the tomb was empty." And that, of course, is vital to Paul. Paul has confidence not because the Spirit makes him feel confident. He has confidence because Christ has been raised. Christ's resurrection is the dawn of something new. And it's the foundation of our resurrection. God has raised Christ and will raise us again with Christ. And that allows Paul to look at his ministry and see encouragement and hope in his ministry. His ministry is spreading the news of God's grace. And he sees that as kind of secondary evidence, if you like, of the truth that he's declared. That when the gospel is preached, people are passing from death to life, there and then, as they grasp the gospel by faith. The power of the preaching of the gospel in the present demonstrates the power of the resurrection in the future. Remember 1 Corinthians, when Paul makes great play in chapter 1, where he says, many of you are the scum of the earth, but you've passed from death to life, pointing to the power of the cross, the power of the life and work of the Lord Jesus Christ. And that then gives Paul an eternal perspective on his immediate suffering. His outward suffering is connected to inner renewal. It's not exactly the resurrection, but it's sort of analogous to it. To be resurrected, you have to die. To experience the power of the resurrection in its fullness, you first of all have to have become as weak as you possibly can. Your body has to have given way. It's very interesting at the moment. There's a long war against the human body that's gone on, and we increasingly try to argue that our bodies have very little to do with who we are in a primary sense. Fascinating amicus brief in the Dobbs case. I'm not a lawyer, so I can't go into the legal arguments being made in it, but the amicus brief filed by the professional women athletes in the United States. Fascinating reading because of the way they talk about their bodies. Their bodies are not them. They talk about their bodies as a carpenter might talk about a saw, or a plumber might talk about a wrench. Their bodies are tools that allow them to realize who they really are. That's not the Bible's position. We are our bodies, and our bodies will die. You can self-identify as immortal if you wish, but sooner or later your body will contradict you on that point. But that's the great news, isn't it? The resurrection destroys death by subverting it, not by avoiding it. And in the meantime, suffering is dealt with, not by eliminating it, but by subverting it. Paul's suffering in his ministry becomes a kind of analogy of the cross, an analogy of the ministry of Christ himself. Now, not all Christians are called to suffer. I had 3 years of misery in a 6-year pastorate. And thankfully it's over and I'm never going back. Not all Christians are called to suffer. Very few are called to suffer as Paul did. But we know that when it happens, the Lord will use it for his greater glory. It may be a mystery to us of where it comes from and why it happens at this point. But the one thing we can know for certain is that the Lord will subvert it. And that, of course, brings Paul to look for the coming glory. Paul reminds the Corinthians in this passage that the present time has to be set in the context of eternity. Things can seem very huge that are not very huge. I remember one of the sad things about I hate London, generally. I grew up in the West, in a rural part of the country. We distrusted Londoners almost as much as we distrusted foreigners, if I could put it that way. A very insular sort of community. My wife and I were back in my home village a year or two ago. We were in the local pub having lunch, and the couple next to us were chatting to the barman, and the barman asked them, "Are you from around here?" And they said, "Oh no, we're from Chalford." And my wife said, "Well, where's Chalford?" And I said, "It's about 2 miles that way." It's a very, very local. But just this is completely irrelevant. My favorite all news is local news. Is we also lived in a small town in Scotland, almost a village in Scotland, on the northeast coast, where Donald Trump, after we'd moved, Donald Trump bought a golf course. And on the day he won the election in 2016, the headlines in the local newspaper in this small town in Scotland were, "Local businessman becomes president of the United States." I thought it was that's totally irrelevant to what I'm saying, but it just came to my mind as I was thinking there. But I remember, one of the things I hate about London now is they're building skyscrapers. London no longer looks like London to me anymore. It looks like every other city in the world. I remember when I arrived in the States in 2001, I'd seen hardly any skyscrapers in my life. And my wife and I went to New York with the kids, and we came out of the subway. And I think I think from memory, by the Empire State Building, which of course is iconic because of King Kong, etc., etc. And I remember just standing and staring at this thing. I had never seen a building that big in my life. It seemed huge. Yesterday, because Pittsburgh is a difficult airport to get to it from, directly from anywhere, it seems. I had to fly from Memphis to LaGuardia. And as is the way when you fly into New York, there's always a little bit of circling while you wait for a slot. And I'm one of those weird people. I don't listen to music on planes. I either read a book or I stare out the window. I stare at the clouds. 150 years ago, nobody could have seen that sight. You look down on the clouds, it's amazing. Anyway, it was a clear sky, and we were flying over Manhattan, and I was picking out some of the buildings. I saw the Empire State Building, and it looked so tiny. It looked so tiny because I was so high above it. I had a very different perspective on the Empire State Building than I did when I walked out of that subway station 20 years ago. Perspective is everything. What Paul is saying in this passage in one way is this: some things in this life can seem terribly important and sometimes terribly painful. And they are. They are important. When that young man came to my office and said, I think there's a problem between my mum and dad and we need help, that's important. It's a very important thing. I had to sit and listen, and I had to take what he said very, very seriously indeed. And yet, in the grand scheme of eternity, it's just a tiny drop in the ocean. One of the tricks, I think, in pastoral ministry is surely this. Maybe trick is the wrong word. Maybe trick is a word that trivializes it. But one of the things pastors have to do is they have to take very seriously the pain and suffering that they see in their congregation, or perhaps they're subjected to by their congregation. They have to take it seriously. When a man is beating his wife, that has to be taken seriously. But on the other hand, they have to set that also in the context of eternity, lest they become overwhelmed by it. And that's what Paul is doing here when he uses this amazing language of glory. It's powerful, isn't it? For this light momentary affliction is preparing us for an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison. If you read 2 Corinthians, I preached all the way through it. And I often wonder, I had another friend who preached all the way through it, and as soon as he finished, his ministry descended into crisis and division. The same happened to me. And I wonder, is this God's way of preparing people for crisis in their ministry? So maybe I'm advising you, whatever you do, don't preach on 2 Corinthians. You're setting yourself up for real disaster. But when you preach your way through 2 Corinthians, it is painful seeing what Paul went through. The long list of indignities and agonies, and worst of all for Paul is his struggles for the church. He's flogged, he's imprisoned, he's shipwrecked, all of these things that would completely dominate the imagination of me if any one of them had happened to me. And yet Paul says the thing that really keeps him lying awake at night are the churches and the struggles in the churches. And I'm sure that he must have felt it deeply as a human being, that the very people that in some ways he'd given everything for were the very people who despised him. Maybe your experience of ministry is like mine. I found when I left, the people who came up and thanked me for being pastor were the people who didn't really need a pastor. They were great. The people who despised me and made speeches about me and almost spat on me as I walked out the door and presumably danced in the streets of Philadelphia once I'd gone, they were the people that I'd given hours and hours to helping over the years. And they took it as an entitlement and then threw it back in my face. That's hard. How much harder is it for Paul? I didn't go through anything like what Paul went through for these people, and yet they throw it back in his face. And yet he refers to that as a light momentary affliction. That's stunning. That's stunning language. Why is it a light momentary affliction? Because he has this great grasp of the eternal weight of God's glory. That's what relativizes everything for Paul. It allows him to keep everything in perspective. If I can recommend, this sounds a sort of nerdy recommendation, but one of the things that I most love about the ancient church fathers is they grasp the glory of God. If you can read a little book by Gregory of Nazianzus, the 5 theological orations, you will come away with your minds blown by the glory of God. Think about preaching on the Transfiguration. When I was putting together my Christology course here for the college, I dropped a note to friends in various Christian denominations, and I was chatting to an Orthodox priest and saying, if you were teaching this course, what would you do? And he laughed and he said, well, I'd do something no Protestant would do. And I said, what's that? And he said, I'd speak about the Transfiguration. He said, you guys never talk about that. And I said, yes, we do. And then I reflected and I thought, I don't think I've ever heard a sermon on the Transfiguration. Maybe he's right. I wasn't going to tell him he was right, but I felt the pain. Think about the Transfiguration. What is the Transfiguration? Well, one of the things that the early church fathers are very mesmerized by is the idea of God as light. When you think about God as light, we don't actually see light. We see light, we see things that light bounces off, but we don't see light itself. So how do you ever see God? Well, I remember those days when you were a kid, perhaps, and you had a flashlight and you put it under your hand and your hand glowed red. You saw the light, but you didn't. What you saw was the illuminated flesh. The Transfiguration. The Transfiguration allows us to see the glory of God because it makes light visible to us at that point. I'm sure that Paul is thinking about that here as he writes. So, putting all of this together then, what are some practical steps we might take to be resilient in the ministry? Well, I'm going to say this. If you don't have a good doctrine of God, you will not be resilient in the ministry. That's the first thing. It's not the only thing, but that's the foundation. We have to have a vision of the glory of God grounded in what the Bible teaches us about God. Secondly, we need to understand our place in the history of God's people. Sometimes, knowing that others have suffered is not much of an encouragement. When I teach against the suffering of God in my classes. I try to present the case sympathetically, and then I try to show why it's wrong. And one of the things I think it falls down on is often those who claim that God suffers, they see it as a very therapeutic and a good thing. And intuitively it seems to be so. But, if you've got cancer and you go to your doctor, and the doctor says, I've got some bad news and I've got some good news. Bad news is you've got cancer. Good news is I've got cancer too, and I know exactly what you're going through. That's not as great as the doctor saying, the good news is I know how to solve the problem. So knowing that others have suffered is not on its own an immediate cure, but it can certainly help. My wife is a huge fan of the books of Johnny Erickson Tada, and her books have been immensely helpful to her over the years, as she's suffered a bit herself and as she's had loved ones suffer. We had a nephew committed suicide in 2018. 21-year-old just came home and killed himself one day. And Johnny's books are very helpful to my wife in addressing those kind of tragedies. Secondly, understand the vital importance of the resurrection. The resurrection is what allows us to make sense of our suffering, I think. Thirdly, focus on the things of eternity, the things that are unseen. I'm with those who reject the notion that being too heavenly minded makes one useless on earth. It's not the case. It flies in the face of what Paul says here and what he says in Colossians. Focusing upon the things above, that's what stops us being overwhelmed with despair in the present. I would also say worldliness. Reflecting on eternity is a great cure for worldliness. And often, we tend to have very worldly views of worldliness. We tend to think worldliness is consumerism, or it's the sexual revolution, or something like that. I've been struck over the last couple of years. Worldliness, I think, also plays into our sense of time. We live in a world where we like everything to happen pretty quickly. I even asked a Catholic friend about this recently. I said, my impression is people become saints quicker in the Catholic Church these days. And he said, oh yeah. He said there's some reasons, legitimate reasons for that. Might be that we have better ways of investigating miracles now, he said. But he said more than anything else, it's that we all like to see our heroes be made saints before we ourselves die. Interesting. I used the example in one of my classes here of Cologne Cathedral in Germany. It's a great, if ever you're passing through Cologne, it's like a quarter of a mile away from the railway station. If you've got 20 minutes, you can dash over, see one of the great examples of Gothic architecture in the world, and then still catch your train. They started building Cologne Cathedral, I think, in 1244. They suspended building in 1560. They recommenced building in the 19th century and completed it in around about 1888, I think. So it was roughly 650 years to build a cathedral. That's striking. Now, on day one, when they laid the first foundation stone, I don't think anybody there expected it to take 650 years to build. But I'm 100% confident that nobody on day one thought they would live to worship God in that building. They knew that they were not building for themselves. They had a long vision. Where did that come from? Well, maybe some of them just did it for the money, but I'm thinking the architect, the people with the imaginative vision, it came from understanding the greatness of God and therefore their place within the historical process. Their task was not to complete everything by next Wednesday. Their task was to work for God's glory in the long term. And I think one of the things we need to cure ourselves of despair, is to realize our limitations. We're not going to fix things by next Wednesday. Maybe we're not going to fix some things in our own lifetime. But we can be faithful in the place we've been set. And we can make sure that there are things that the next generation can build upon. That's the theology then. I want to end very briefly by saying, well, practically, what should this look like? Well, the first thing, I think if I was asked what was the toughest thing for me about being in the ministry, practically, it was not actually sitting regularly under the preaching of the word myself. Where does this vision come from for most Christians? I think it comes from the proclamation of the word. The minister standing up proclaiming the word. Go back to my liking for Luther. Luther will talk about the importance of the word that comes from outside. For Luther, the word is confrontational. For Luther, I think the proclaimed word is more powerful than the read word. You can read the Bible for yourself. Most of Luther's congregants couldn't do that, of course. Literacy was about 8% or something, I think, in Luther's Wittenberg during his time. It was rising, but it was very low. For Luther, The transformative word is the word that comes from outside. So the first thing I want to suggest to those of you in pastoral ministry is the theology I've articulated here can't simply be learned by reading a book. I think it comes from sitting under the preaching of the word, and that can be a tough call. But maybe there's one Sunday a month, or one evening a month. Maybe you only have one service on a Sunday, so you're free to go somewhere else for that other service slot. But trying to place yourself under the proclamation of the word, I think, is a very, very important thing. It's important for all Christians. And tragically and oddly, those who are tasked with preaching it to others find themselves in the difficult position of not being able to be regularly under it themselves. It's not a one-size-fits-all answer. Think about how that might work in your situation. Bring yourself under the preaching of the word. Secondly, Luther would say the external word doesn't just come from the preached word. Luther went back and forward on whether confession, whether penance should be kept as a sacrament. It's really odd. In the Babylonian captivity of the church, one of his great treatises of 1520, he starts by saying there are 3 sacraments, and then at the end he says, actually, I think there are only 2 sacraments, and he drops confession. He wants to keep it, but he ends up dropping it as a sacrament. He maintained the practice himself throughout his entire life, and there's some very interesting debates within Lutheranism on whether confession should be kept or not. He kept it himself because he felt it was vitally important to have somebody look him in the eye and proclaim the gospel to him. How does that translate to the present day? Well, I would say, in my experience, it translates in this way. Good elders. The thing that made my ministry possible for those years was I had rock-solid elders. There was one guy, he's very young. I always used to dread if the phone went and it was his name on it at 11 o'clock at night, I knew it was going to be bad. I knew that I'd done something wrong, and his conscience meant he'd got to phone me up and rebuke me. And I knew that he'd spent all day worrying about it. And finally, at 11 o'clock at night, man, I've run out of time. I've got to do something. But I appreciated that. We had a couple of shouting matches on the phone. But I would say this, he was always right and I was always wrong. And I always appreciated him calling me out. Elders, important in this. But I also think friends. I'm a Presbyterian, so I'm connected to presbytery, and I have a pool of ministers that I can draw on for advice. But oddly, I would say the ministers I've most consistently drawn on for advice over the years have been ministers not in my denomination. Partly because when we get together with them, we're not moaning about our denomination. The stuff that crowds in denominational politics is of no interest between us. And I've appreciated having friends who've been able to talk to me about the glory of God. And it was interesting that my friend whose ministry sort of went into crisis after he'd preached through 2 Corinthians, I was able to encourage him during that time. And then when the same happened to me, guess what? He was there to repay the favor. And the good thing was we weren't in the same denomination, so he didn't have the same sort of feudal and political ties that might have twisted his advice or his counsel in some way. And then finally, again, I come back to this again and again. We need to frame and inform our worship services in a way that shapes our expectations. Years and years ago, I dashed off a small article that I think isn't it the way you spend years working on a book and it drops dead from the press? You write something when you're really annoyed in the space of about 45 minutes, and you get more positive correspondence about it over the years than anything else. I wrote a little thing called What Can Miserable Christians Sing? So I've just had a vision. I once went to Mark Dever's church, and he was telling me in the morning, I'll give all my interns your little article, What Can Miserable Christians Sing, to read. And I went into the restroom, and as I was washing my hands, I looked over into the rubbish bin, and there was a copy of my article screwed up in the rubbish bin, which I took a photo of, and I sent her. I said, this is great. You give it to them, it's like, throw it in the trash straight away. What was interesting about that article was I was trying to make the case that we need to do something in worship that provides people with a language and a logic to understand their suffering. And it's not that some contemporary, and this is not a bash at contemporary worship, by the way. It's a bash at bad contemporary worship, or it's a bash at bad hymns. It's not that contemporary worship songs can't do that. It's typically they don't. The Psalms provide us with a wonderful vocabulary, grammar, and syntax for thinking about the suffering of the church and the suffering of individuals. And some people may say on a Sunday, why do we sing that miserable psalm today? Because I'm feeling great. Well, that's great. But when you sing that psalm, you learn something that comes back to you. It's amazing how music and words together, I think, are always more powerful than words on it. I'm a big preaching guy, but I also think that people probably learn more of their theology from what they sing than what they hear proclaimed. It's weird. I was at the Soul Music Museum on Thursday listening to all these great tracks, and I was horrified at how word perfect I was on so many soul songs from the 60s, and I'm not even into 60s soul. I must have just heard them on the radio growing up, and they stuck somewhere in my mind because the tune was catchy. We need to think about our worship. Do we have a worship that allows us to speak to our people with conviction and in a way that will resonate with them about the eternal weight of glory to come? Do we have a form of worship that treats present suffering seriously and yet relativizes it in the context of God's glory and of eternity? That's an important question to ask. So, the word from outside. Get yourself, pastors, as you can, under the preaching of the word. Get yourself friends. Get yourself good elders who are able to encourage you by speaking the word to you. And reflect upon worship. Think about that passage in Paul and ask yourself, does our form of worship and do the content of our worship present the reality of what Paul is speaking to there? I have a few minutes left for questions, if anybody has any questions they'd like to ask. Otherwise, I think things are sort of winding up here. Any questions? No questions.
I'll ask, maybe, I'm not sure where I'm going with this question, but I'm curious if you know chronologically maybe which came first, with 2 Corinthians or Thessalonians, or I mean, huh? No, what I'm preaching to right now, I'm losing my ever-living mind this hour. Ephesians, thank you.
Well, I'm going to deflect that question to the biblical scholars room. Chris, any idea?
Because I'm wondering, Ephesians to me seems like Paul's deepest heartfelt love letter to the churches. And yet 2 Corinthians, he's, and a lot of his letters are kind of lamenting and smacking people upside the head and getting right.
Yeah. And I don't see any reason why Paul wouldn't have varied from day to day.
Sure.
I mean, we all, particularly when you're going through extremes of emotions, it can be a real seesaw. It can be a real seesaw. But I do think, though, that the way Paul presents his suffering in 2 Corinthians, there's a very clear polemical purpose there. It's kind of gloves off. Okay, so you're pointing to all this stuff, and you're saying, this indicates that I'm just not as good as the super apostles. Okay, well, let's lay it all out, and let's set it in the shadow of the cross, and let's see what happens. So I do think that Paul's tone is not just experientially driven, but is also polemically, rhetorically driven as well in 2 Corinthians. It's a powerful letter. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
You mentioned that the resurrection really helps us to understand suffering. Maybe I just missed it, but can you unpack that a little bit?
Yeah. Well, what is the greatest suffering that anyone can go through? It's got to be death. And we know that death has been subverted for the greater good. Without death, there can be no resurrection. The resurrection is God's magnificent yes over the no of death, if you like. So everything else, I think, pales in comparison to that. So, and when Paul uses this language of though our outer self is wasting away, our inner self is being renewed, he sort of pointed out this kind of spiritual resurrection going on here, if you like. Yeah, I'm dying outwardly. By all the standards of the world, I'm fading away. I'm weak. I'm being crushed. But inwardly I am powerful, because none of this stuff can separate me from the love of Christ. None of this stuff can deny the truth of the resurrection for me. Does that make sense? I mean, the way I'd present it in class, sometimes we look at the problem of evil. It seems to me the Bible does not deal with the problem of evil in terms of telling us where it comes from. The snake's just there. Milton tries to solve it by saying, well, you're picking up on legends about an angelic rebellion and the spirit of Satan enters the snake. Well, maybe, but that simply pushes the problem back to an angelic rebellion. Why do they rebel? The Bible doesn't care to answer the problem of evil in terms of its origin. It answers the problem of evil in terms of its resolution. And the resolution is the resurrection of Christ and the consummation of all things at the end of time. And so I think every lesser evil has to be set within that context. Why has that child got cancer? Goodness only knows. I cannot, if I'm pastorally addressing a family that are suffering from that, I cannot say to them, well, it's happened for this reason. What I can say is, I have no idea why it's happened. I know the agony you're going through is terrible, but I can promise you the resurrection. In amongst all the darkness and pain, I can at least point you to the resurrection. Does that make sense? Thanks.